Water comes from the kind.
Hey, Drew. Yes. Morning, John. Okay. For the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about exegesis and what that means, and we've actually been talking about it as a method of interpretation. And there are elements, come on in. There are elements and aspects to exegesis. We've been working with the handout. I brought it with me today.
I saw that word exegesis in an article I was just reading, and I see, or maybe it was in a book that I'm reading. I can't tell you what it was, or it didn't refer to it.
Is that right?
Yeah. It was a novel, historical novel.
No. Well,
I got, oh, I got that one. Thank you.
Becky got this out of the Patriot News.
It's a book for.
And it's an article that faith group ranks members of Congress on their votes based on biblical principles. And I thank you for gave it to me, but she said, well, you want to say?
Well, it caught my eye and I read the article and it was everything Dave's been talking about the last 2 years. Like I underlined eisegesis in there and talk about that.
It strikes me that the folks at this Center for Biblical Business, in quotes, are doing a bit of what we in the biz would call eisegesis. That is, reading into the text, whatever it is, these folks want to communicate, or pulling biblical passages and from what philosophers have said to prove their point.
Who are you quoting?
Who am I quoting?
The
The Reverend Sandra Strauss, a former director of advocacy and ecumenical outreach for the Pennsylvania Council of Churches. But, so this article,
The thing about the article though, it's rating the congressman. Guess who got the highest rating? 98% that follow biblical principles, according to this.
Fetterman? Fetterman?
Scott Perry.
Oh, I keep
No.
Thought process.
Few Democrats who read it too, like Elizabeth Warren and people like that. Scott Perry, 98%.
According to the eisegesis
No,
rating.
putting to this alliance, it's called the Christian Business Alliance.
Well.
Right.
It's a no.
It's not a Christian alliance.
well, in the Christian Business Alliance, they're,
Their version of it.
yeah.
Oh, David, there was something I was reading on like some of the quotes from Charlie Kirk. And I remember it was a Jeremiah thing, and then the person said, well, let's go to the whole passage of that as
Yeah.
opposed to that one sentence.
Yeah,
And say this is as opposed to the whole.
yeah. And that's part of eisegesis, but it's also what we call proof text, where there's a passage that it's somebody's eye, it's what the point that you want to make, but sometimes, or maybe more times than not, they're taking it out of context. So then we need to, you're saying, look at it in its full context. Is that what this passage really meant?
Right, and that's what this
Yeah.
scholar would refer to that. Yeah.
And I'm being critical of Charlie Kirk, because I know that can get people in trouble, but yeah.
I don't think that's.
I don't think it was.
I think you're safe in this room.
Yeah,
Okay.
but,
Everybody
he would probably be one who, who takes things out of context just to, and we all pick and choose. So even the Church of the Brethren, we tend to gravitate more toward the Sermon on the Mount than other things. So we all pick and choose the goal, and that's what we stress in this class. When we do our biblical interpretation or our exegesis, we want to do it in a responsive way. So and as less biased as possible, even though we're all biased, so.
I was gonna say, isn't that our bias that we're doing it in a responsible way?
Well, yeah. There you go. But, yeah, we would have some other biased people and a different bias, say something different. But yeah, we're struggling. We're struggling in a good way to try to grapple with what the text means. And that's what exegesis is. We've been going over exegesis, and I've been going over the elements one at a time. And for the last several weeks, and it even was back in June for our last class, I said, give us some passages so we can apply what we're learning to a specific passage and do exegesis in real time. And so I may put Joe on the spot. He says, okay, I'll give you a passage, and let's do Genesis 6:1-4. And it's gonna have some interesting things to it. But let me put it in its historic context right away, that this Genesis 6-4 falls into the part in of the Bible that is Genesis 1-11. I'll talk about this quite a bit. And these are chapters 1-11, so 6 falls into that. There's no time frame here. There's no historic era here. We're not talking about the pre-exilic time. We're not talking about the time of the judges. So, and that's true of primeval history or mythology accounts. They tend not to put a time frame to it. So this is Genesis 1-11 is at the beginning of the book, at the beginning of the Bible. And it's the ancient Israel's prehistory, before you start getting into more historical accounts. And I'm not talking about pure history. It's not till we get to Genesis 12 with Abraham that you start to have a time period which we call the patriarchs or the ancestors, about the 17th or 18th century. Genesis 1-11, it's a creation story. Creation story number 1, Genesis 1, creation story number 2, Genesis 2 and 3. And then there's Genesis 4, which is Cain and Abel story. Genesis 5 is a genealogy. And then Genesis 6-9 is the flood story. And then, bless you, you have a genealogy in chapter 10, and then in 11 you have the Tower of Babel. So let's go back over that. Creation, the first murder or whatever, Cain and Abel, the flood, Tower of Babel. These are all stories that we don't really read in a literal sense, in a historic sense. You know, these aren't people that you can verify archaeological, or people try, and that we're going to find the ark and all of that. But this would be if the Old Testament or ancient Israel had a mythology, this would be it. We tend to call it their primeval history. It's not really history. Again, there's no historical era. These stories read differently than anything else we have in the Bible. Then when you get to Genesis 12 and through Genesis and into Exodus, we are talking about a time period that can be verified archaeology. You get into Exodus, yes, we can verify that time period of the pharaohs and Moses, and that can be demonstrated archaeology from archaeology. But none of this can. Any questions? And I've talked about this before. Huh? It is, but you won't be quiet for long.
Well, as many of you know, I grew up in this church. I guess I'm not done growing. But
Oh,
I've been taught from day one that this is how you interpret scripture. There's things you just don't read literally. But I know there's other churches that teach it the exact other way around. This is the exact spoken word of God. And so how do you talk to people like that?
well, sometimes,
How can you possibly alter their thinking a little bit to look at it in more the way you describe?
well,
How do you make
go to alter someone's thinking, I mean. For me, I try to figure it out. I have trouble enough working on myself than on working on other people, so, because the reason I say that, their goal might be to try to alter our thinking. So we have to be careful, but if someone, I do know people who are on the much more, literal view of scripture. Who do have an open mind and are willing to dialogue. And then there are some who aren't. This is it. So when they draw a line in the sand and that's it, then it's hard to have a conversation. And we see that more now than ever with politics and whatever, right? I mean, if you're looking at a view differently about the administration and you want to talk to someone else who looks at it very differently than we really can't have a conversation. And it's not that it always hasn't been that way, it just seems to, things have been taken to a new level due to rhetoric and other things. So one way would be just to be, keep the rhetoric down and just try to, if you can, talk to someone if they are open to a conversation. If some of the words I just said about this would have people with smoke out their ears. I had someone come into my office when I was pastor at Green Tree, and it was very clear he was trying to get candidates who were pro Second Amendment. And he didn't know anything about Church of the Brethren, obviously. And he just thought that I was a pastor, I was a religious person, I believe what he believed. Very, very naive. And I had a book on my desk that I was reading. It was called about the impossibility of, I forget the title, something about the impossibility of reading the Bible literally, and just how it's just because you have multiple authors over multiple time periods, you can't read it literally. And I mentioned that to him, and he didn't get it at first. And as soon as I used the word contradiction, he went nuts. His eyes got big, and he called me the devil. As soon as I said that, the word contradiction and the Bible, he just went nuts, and he didn't want anything to do with me, although he did want to tell me what he thought of me, and then he wanted to dump and run. And he did that. And I called up the organization. I said, you can't have people going around the churches and doing this stuff.
David,
But that's an example. So I hope that helps.
the other night, where the gentleman ended the program on Christian nationalism, he said, when you get in dialogue with somebody, arguing opposite will never win. You just can't do it. You can't do it. So his technique, I think, what I took away was to ask questions about what that person actually believes and thinks, and how that's working for them. And no, they don't want to know your side, so you might as well have them think through their own side.
Yeah.
when Ann
And
and
that's
I
a
were
good
talking,
strategy.
when Ann and I were talking about takeaways from the other evening,
Yeah,
the same evening,
right.
Friday. He said the professor from Lancaster said something that my dad said
Right,
over and over again, yeah. Kill them with kindness. Rather than argue and get in a spat with them, just kill them with kindness. Ask some leading questions, maybe, well, what led you to believe this? Try to draw them out a little, see if they can be flexible, and if they can't, just kill them with kindness. Don't
Right.
get in a fight with them. That's no fun.
You know, and that sounds easy, but it's hard. It's hard, but you know, it makes sense because Martin Luther King said that. I'm trying to get the quote, but you just have to love your enemy. So you just have to do that. So that's, and it is hard. And what we have to do, and then we'll move on, but it helps to take emotion out of the equation.
That's what's hard.
And that is hard. That's the hardest part. But if they're emotionally charged and we get emotionally charged, it doesn't matter what we're talking about, politics, religion, Bible, family issues, how to do something in your family.
Football.
Yeah, football, yeah. Once emotion gets in there, then it is done, the discussion's done.
Well, one of the things I always think back to, like the college has what, they always have that peace conference.
Yeah.
And the one time it was a representative from, I think, Maryland. And what she said always stuck with me. The women that got together who were in the House and the Senate, they chose to focus on things they agreed rather than focus on things they disagreed, to move forward with those options that they felt were mine and should be done.
And unfortunately,
It's
that's not
gone.
happening in the congressional branch right now. Along those lines, Jim Wallace wrote a book, God's Politics. The right gets it wrong and the left doesn't get it. And so, so that subtitle is to get your attention. But throughout that book, I think it came out in 04, 05, Wallace was arguing, yes, we have hot button issues, but take any hot button issues, we can find common ground, whether it's pro-life, whatever, what's the other one?
Pro-choice. Pro-choice.
Choice, yeah. So whether it's that or any other issue, we can find common ground and let's work on that. And that was the thesis of his whole book, and for examples. So you raise a good question, Craig, and the rest of you as we talk about this, but I don't want to talk about Genesis 6:1-4 without putting it in its context of we call it either primeval history or the prehistory of ancient Israel, because we have to understand it from that standpoint. Because as we read it carefully, which we're going to do, a lot of questions are going to come up. So we have to remember how we're looking at it. So the first thing we want to do, turn to your Bibles, Genesis 6:1-4. And before we dive into it and read it carefully, we have to define the passage. Now, Joe suggested 6:1-4. Now we have to look at that. Is that the passage we want to look at? Is it a passage? So how are we defining this? Should it be smaller? Should it be larger? So, and we talked about that when we were looking at the text and translation aspect of exegesis. Define the passage. Where does it begin and where does it end? So what we want to do, where does it begin? We have 6:1. Let's go to Genesis 5:32. So let's see what comes before it. And as I said earlier, chapter 5 is primarily a genealogy. And then we start to get to the end of that, 5:30. Lamech lived after the birth of Noah 595 years and so forth. All the days of Lamech were 777. After Noah was 500 years old, Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And then the next verse reads, when people began to multiply, this is the New RSV translation, on the face of the ground. So you see well, you tell me what you see.
Change,
Okay,
it's a change of thought.
change of thought. And that's what you're looking for when you move from one passage to another. Is there a change of thought? So for this chapter 5 is a genealogy, and I don't know, this is winding it up in some way. And then it looks like we have the beginning of a narrative. Okay? Now, if we're looking at Genesis 6:1-4, let's look at Genesis 6:5. Verse 5,
Okay.
6 verse 5, so.
David, it sounds like today.
Well, yeah.
Our interpretation of that. There weren't those others that think were fine.
Yeah, we heard that at the disaster response auction, one of the auctioneers. There was a quilt, red, blue, and bloom, red, white, and bloom. And then he went into a 2-minute thing of how this is the greatest country on earth. You see that flag over there? And I'm thinking,
Rather,
he doesn't know he's a rather crowd, or if he does, he's definitely trying to make a statement.
I'm sure he was brothering himself.
Could have been, sure. Yeah, there's.
There are people, my brother was sitting, I was saying, and I said it out loud. That's debatable at this point, when he's saying we're the
Yeah.
best country in the world. And
So
my-
you heard it, yeah.
Yes, and my brother's saying, oh, well, that's what I believe.
It was interesting that there was just a splattering of applause.
Yeah.
It's not everybody.
Yeah.
Jumping.
Well, I'm sitting there, and I had my head down, and I'm going like this, I can't believe it.
Yeah.
I missed it.
Well, it shouldn't, yeah, it shouldn't.
Yeah, it was.
Oh, it is a disaster, okay.
But we're not supposed to be making it.
Just wait for the day, it's the eighth of the class.
Okay. So what do you think? Does verse 4 end and a new thought, as Paul said, begins in 6:5, or is that the continuing of verse 4? And I can tell you, not all scholars agree on this.
What's a Nephilim?
Yeah.
For now, let's just call them giants. We will get into that.
So there,
so then it looks like 1-4 is like a exposition setting the scene, and then 5 is the actual like what, and this is what happened in that time.
Yeah.
The Lord saw.
Yeah. And a lot, what happens if you keep reading 5 and go to 8? The flood story doesn't begin until verse 9, but verses 5, 6, 7, and 8 are often considered to be the prelude to the flood story. And then you could even argue that verses 1-4 are feeding into that. Could be a prelude to the prelude, but verses 1-4 are really talking about. See, you have, before you get to 6, you have Adam and Eve, you have Cain and Abel, and then that's it, and it says, well, in the genealogy, if you read that, it talks about, I think I made a list of people. Oh, yeah, there it is. Seth, Enoch, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, and Methuselah. And there's no, again, this is mythology and primeval history. There's no effort to say where, their wives came from. And that's not important. They somehow, they had daughters. That's it. Anything, not only where their wives came from, doesn't even mention the women who bore these children in that genealogy. So, what we have here is, verses 1 to 4 are just talking about, yeah, you had Adam and Eve and that up to this point. Now people are the earth is being populated. Let's go back to 4. What does it say? 1:4. Chapter 1, verse 1, sorry. When people began to multiply, we can work at that on the face of the ground. And daughters were born.
How come daughters were the only one named in there, not sons?
Because then they talk.
Well,
The
that's,
sons saw that the daughters were beautiful.
well, we're not there yet.
It was the sons of God.
Sticking with one.
Wait, yeah. So, and daughters were born to them. Does that mean that they just started to have daughters at this point? They were all just having sons before.
But there must have been daughters before, or wives still.
How are they making new for
They're not on the list, so I don't know. They're all just.
Again,
No, it's 1,000 years, so.
In chapter 5 at the end, verse 25, and after it was talking about Methuselah. After Methuselah lived 782 years and had other sons and daughters. It's mentioned daughters there also. All together, it's,
Well, it's early, it's like Genesis just talks about sons and daughters.
yeah, so sons are being born, otherwise they couldn't have children.
Sons and daughters is all through 5.
Yeah.
That's right.
It's in 5. I'm
Yeah,
saying
right.
12 and.
But in verse 1, it just says when people, Adam is the word here, so it's, the Hebrew word is Adam, when people, and that can mean Adam is a proper name, but it can also mean people, just as the Greek anthropos, which is how the Greek translates Adam here, is anthropos, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. When people or Adam began to multiply on the face of the ground, daughters were born. And that's probably a lead in to verse 2 to answer Anna's question. That we're stressing in verse 2, we'll get to that in a minute, but we're stressing sons of God and daughters of men, but we'll get there in a minute. But before we do that,
David, can I make it really simple? And you know me, I'm a simple thinker.
yeah, but I also know when you try to make it simpler. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Well, yeah, that was the answer, Jay.
Yes, dear. Okay.
We know this is a patriarchal society.
Yeah.
So they're going to refer to the men as sons of God. But the girls, well, they're the daughters of men. So where did they come from? Well, everybody's having babies, girls and boys. But the men are called sons of God and the daughters are called sons of men. Maybe that's too simplistic, but that's just kind of how I always saw it.
Well, let's start there, but we're gonna find out in a minute that the sons of God probably aren't humans.
This is divine.
So
They're aliens.
Okay, we're not there yet. But this is gonna be a, look at Jody smiling. Gonna be a very good class. Just hang in there. And we'll get there. In a minute, we're gonna talk about the sons of God, but before we do that, do we have a passage?
Yeah.
1 to 4?
Yeah.
So we have a unit?
Yes.
Okay, so you see how it begins, you see how it ends. I don't need to spend a lot of time on that, but I do wanna make sure we're on the same page. And as I said, some scholars like to combine verses 5 to 8 with 1 to 4. So they will have verses 1 to 8 as a unit, where verses 1 to 4 feeds into 5 to 8. But most commentators, most interpreters are gonna separate 1 to 4 and 5 to 8. So it wasn't challenging Joe, because he and I know that in our minds, this is a separate passage. But I don't want to just assume, if someone throws out a passage, we want to make sure we're not proof texting. So we want to define the passage, and I think we've done that. Now, let's start to look at it verse
Could
by
we
verse.
just go backwards a second?
We can.
What do people have as a heading for that? Above verse 6?
I have
The
the.
I have
flood,
human-
the flood.
I have human.
One at a time, Donna.
I have human corruption.
The
Wow.
The flood.
The flood, so the flood really doesn't begin to verse 9, but your translation or study Bible is starting it in verse 1.
Ancient heroes.
Ancient heroes,
Yeah.
now that has to do with just 1 to 4, that's verse 4 right there,
Ours says the world goes wrong.
okay?
That's mine.
And that's setting it up for the flood. Why does the flood happen in the first place?
Human corruption.
Wickedness of man.
Okay, and mine says the wickedness of humans.
Wickedness in the world.
Okay. Now, you know, these headings aren't part of the manuscript. These are headings that help us, actually, these headings help us to define the passages in the units. The translators are helping us to do this, and so it's good not to ignore the headings, but you don't want to always take the headings at face value either. And they should be scrutinized, but in this case, and you saw the variety. Some want to start the flood story at verse 1, where, as I'm arguing, the flood story really doesn't start till verse 9. So what do we do with verses 1 to 8? Verse 4 talks about the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men or humans. The offspring they're the heroes, they're the renowned ones, they're the giants or whatever. We'll get into that. So we have a unit. Now, I think it might be helpful at this time to just take it one verse at a time, and I think that'll help us get. And we pretty much dealt with verse 1. So when people began to multiply, so what do you have for people in
Man.
verse 1? Man. Most likely, most translations are going to have men.
That's people.
People, human beings, people. So the older translations, like the King James, and it came to pass when men began to multiply. So the older translations are going to have men. But as I said, the Hebrew word here is Adam. And I say Adam as opposed to Adam, because if I put the stress on the first syllable, Adam, that is a way of distinguishing Adam, the
Person.
the person from Adam, which it's the same word, but that meaning, or it can also have the meaning of human beings, people, or men in general, or mankind, but usually in this class, when we use the word mankind, we're really talking about human beings.
Two of the translations in the past would have used man, and their most recent translation switched to mankind. Christian Standard Bible American Standard, how using man of kind instead of man. It's just interesting.
Okay, yeah, and I think what they're trying to do, okay, does man in the way they use the term, does it mean a single individual? When they use mankind, then they're sending the message for talking about humanity in general. But then if people want to get away from the masculine, then they'll move from mankind to human beings or humans. So I'm going to use the word humans, but those, is it time for choir?
Yeah.
So those who need to go, you gotta go. And we'll see you next time.
Okay.
I know, this
Look,
is,
that's not okay.
it's really interesting. Okay. So we have that. So when people or mankind, just depending on where you are with how you wanna define that, but the word Adam is meaning people, not just Adam or one person. So when people began to multiply on the face of the ground, so however that happens, again, this is a prehistory, not all of the this isn't a science narrative, so not everything's going to be going to come out and be defined. You're not going to have all the details, but at some point, this is saying people began to become numerous. They began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them.
I have a question about, you said on the face of the ground. I mean, my Bible has fertile land. How do you get fertility into the face of the ground?
What's the translation?
This is the Common English.
Really?
Common English Bible. It says throughout the fertile land.
I do have that here, yes.
There's a couple places I've seen this fertile land mentioned.
Mine's just on the earth.
Okay, the Hebrew says on the face of. Now, remember. Adam means man, earth is Adamah. That's the feminine of that, so because Adam was made from dust, ground, Adam was made from Adamah. So we don't have to do a whole lot with that, but that's interesting. So the Hebrew says on the face of the ground. Now, I don't know where they're coming from throughout the fertile land. That's not a literal translation.
Interesting addition. I don't know what the point of saying that would be, but
What's that?
I'm just curious why you would add, like, what's the point of adding that if it's not there? It's an interesting.
Yeah,
Doesn't seem like relevant to the rest of what this is talking
well,
about.
I was just thinking that, Ally, I was trying to figure out, because there are times when I like the Common English Bible, but in this case.
Well, in general, do they just talk about people going and moving to lands that are more fertile, like? Isn't that where, like,
Well,
as they spread out, they're going to go to places where they can be farmers and grow things and survive.
well, and they're gonna go where there's water.
Yeah.
And, yeah, so. Yeah, maybe they just threw that in there, because they can't. Yeah,
See, I almost get a sexual meaning out of this. The fertile land and the daughters mentioned
well,
back to back.
there might be
And the
that
daughters-
there,
the
yeah,
Daughters are
there
fertile.
could be.
Do the daughters make the land fertile because they produce?
Right.
But that's what you get out of the English here. That's not what you're getting out of your Hebrew, so
No.
out of the original, so.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and I don't, yeah, I really can't take that a lot further than that unless we had the translators here. I have to find out which one of my friends translated that, but.
I was also thinking just the phrase face of the ground, and I almost harkens back to the three levels, the air, the ground, the water. Water was fertile, produced creatures. The ground produced creatures of various kinds. I don't know what they do with the air producing anything other than like
Right.
critters. And just harken back to the three
Well, it's a
levels.
common, and I think if we go back to Genesis 1, I think we're gonna find that phrase. Someone wants to look that up, but this isn't the only place that occurs. So that's the literal upon, they began to multiply upon the face of the ground. But sometimes people bow down on the face of the ground, or they fall on the face of the ground, or so
Well, so
that's
we
not
use,
an unheard of term.
right, cause like, so we hear the word face and we think of, faces, but it's the, language was this written in or Hebrew. Is it, they don't have the same word for face as face of the ground, do
Yeah.
they? Is it the same word?
It's the same
Oh, okay.
word.
So it does.
But the thing with Hebrew is more so than English, although we do have words that have a wide semantic range.
Yeah.
But the word face would be one of those. It can mean face, but it can also mean it means surface, really. That's how I'm looking at it. It means on the surface of the ground, so face can be surface in that way. So this, and we're going to see this as we work through these verses. There are some words that have different meanings to it. So how do we know that? We have to look at the context. So when you look at the context, this doesn't mean a human face, ground, this means surface. So context is everything a lot of times what we're translating. Okay, and then daughters were born to them, and I think we just leave that there. That, I think that play on words or the reason that that's there will become clear in a minute. So let's be clear on time. Okay, we got 10, 15 minutes. Now let's go to verse 2. We have the sons of God. At least that's what I have.
Divine beings.
Divine beings. Anybody else?
Sons of God.
Sons of God. Divine beings, that would be the CCB. Sons of God. And the Greek is sons of God. Anybody else? NIV, I don't have that here.
Sons of God.
Sons of God, okay. And that's really true to the Hebrew, I would say.
So Jesus' brothers?
Jesus.
Good question, because we were talking about that last time.
The idea that Jesus has always been,
Yeah.
then he was around, apparently. Yeah, was he pulling around down? I
Well,
mean,
you know what it sounds like. It sounds like mythology.
Yes.
right, yeah.
Okay. Joe, we talked about this maybe 3 weeks ago. There are, if you look at the history, the most recent history in the last 200 years or so of what people think sons of God means, there are several interpretations. One is that some people feel that the sons of God actually means human, but that hasn't really carried much weight over the years because sons of God. So a second interpretation has been these are angels, sons of God, angels. But if we look at what an angel is, and I did write some verses down in Genesis 16, an angel comes to Hagar because she's frustrated, she's pregnant, she doesn't know what to do, she's going to the wilderness, she's going to have her baby, she's going to die. And an angel comes and gives her a message. And then in Genesis 18, 3 men and come to visit Abraham, and one of them, and they're seen, they're characterized as angels. They seem to have, and one of them brings a message that this time next year, Sarah's blind son. And then let's go to the New Testament. Mary is visited by an angel. You're gonna have a baby. And the angel visits Joseph too. Says, don't abortion Mary. Go ahead, do what you need to do, what you should do. And God's gonna take care of this. I'm just summarizing the story. So angels have a message. The sons of God here, and when they're used very limitedly in other parts of the Bible, there's no message. The sons of God come and they see the daughters of men, and they'll get into what they do actually, but there's no message. So angels, not quite sure about that. Some have argued, well, they might be a lesser time kind of angel, because they're not called divine beings, but they're called sons of God. But I think the consensus of scholarship, Joe, you'll have to add what what you've read and what you found out, or what you think, is that the sons of God are seen as divine beings. And
What does that mean?
well, I can
Divine being.
let's look at where sons of God are also used. We have to go to Job 1-6 and 2-1.
Job what?
Job chapter 1, verse 6.
Oh,
Job chapter 1, verse 6. Sons of God doesn't, it appears only like 4 times in the Bible. But where it does appear, verse 6, one day the heavenly beings, footnote for me, Hebrew, sons of God, came to present themselves before the Lord. And then the accuser, which is the Satan. And so some of your translations might have Satan or Satan. But the heavenly beings is seen here as God's heavenly entourage. So the sons of God could be a divine council, they could be God's entourage of heavenly beings that surround God. And if you go to 2 verse 1, again, it's the same thing. One day, the heavenly beings, or the sons of God, B'nai Elohim, came to present themselves before the Lord as usual. One other passage would be Psalm 29:1. Yeah, could be.
Cause they're not, they might not be his equals, but they are like,
Go ahead and say that.
I said, it sounds to me like a pantheon, so like in like. Greek mythology, you have these other gods who are around, they're not as powerful as Zeus, but they can come up and talk to him and like have this dialogue. And the Satan, the accuser, like is challenging him, and that happens in the mythology as well, where
The gods are always in conflict.
right, yeah. So it sounds to me like they are not God, they are maybe some sort of divine being.
Yeah.
but wait a minute. Are we saying this is real or this is mythology?
This is Israel prehistory. This is Israel's.
Right.
Because there's not really, there was, mythology is a myth.
Yeah,
I'll push
Yeah,
back on that.
yeah, go ahead.
There are
Please.
two, mythology has a technical scholarly meaning and a cultural meaning. The two are entirely different. The cultural meaning is myth is fake. It's fairy tale. academically means accounts of origins of humans before historical setting.
Prehistory.
And this is what people really believe in cultures. You go to the Native American cultures, they have origin stories. Academically, these are called mythologies. The Native Americans do not view these as false fictional stories. They view them as accounts of origins. How did we get here? And so when biblical scholars in the academic setting wanted to put a label on these origin stories, just like the Greeks had origin stories involving Olympus and the Olympians and the Romans. They call these origin stories mythologies. And then, of course, after the Enlightenment, people began to recognize that these mythologies didn't represent reality.
Right.
And then that changed the name, the term mythology into a simple replacement for fiction. And there's a real problem with that term mythology now because there are two very different meanings.
So it's cultural. Yeah.
It's a cultural understanding.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you really want to get on the wild side, read a scholar by the name of Michael Heiser. Now, Michael Heiser is operating under the assumption that what we see in the Bible is what the cultural people of that time truly understood as really real. There appears to be a time within Judeo history where a pantheon existed, even back to Genesis 1, where it talks about the we in Genesis 1. And there's evidence for this idea that God is not alone. He has a council of beings. And through a lot of the Old Testament, in Genesis especially, you have God as a supreme of this council of beings. And the beings could be assigned to different nations and rulers of nations in the unseen realm, Michael Heiser likes to call this. And so these are not different from what's found in the Hittite cultures, all the ites. There's this common human idea that there is an unseen realm above involving multiple divine entities sharing responsibility and control over humans. And that the Hebrew went through this stage of development as well.
But that's what set them apart. Was Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one.
Right,
What
because
set them apart from the Hittites or whoever was that they believed in one.
because they're one. After a while, the Hebrews understood that their one was the supreme power of that pantheon, and that one not only operated in Israel, but worldwide. And the other deities, in a sense, junior deities, if you like, were beholden to the prime deity.
And that's what kind of sets it apart is in a lot of the Egyptian mythology, Mesopotamian mythology, Ugaritic mythology, Hurrian or Hittite mythology, and they're all kind of different, but there is a time where sometimes there's a prime god or a chief god, and then sometimes that god has to either rise up to that or earn that, however you want to say it.
Well, isn't there, I forget who it is, but isn't there a story with like two pyres and like, well, my god's going to burn this pyre and your god's not going to do anything, and we usually take that,
Yeah.
and we usually take that to be like, well, that's because our god's real and theirs doesn't even exist. But couldn't you also read it that, well, they're within the context of that moment, they're both real, but our God is stronger and able to do this. It burns the whole fire and the other fire, right? So like,
He said, let the true God. Elijah said, let the true God.
right, but I'm not reading it, but what's he saying that their God, they're just misled, their God doesn't exist at all, and our God is actually real, and theirs doesn't
Well,
even exist.
You have that, see, at some point, there is tension in the scriptures about this. There are some point where the sons of God kind of drops out of the narrative. And so when you get to the exilic period, and in the second Isaiah, which will be Isaiah 40 to 55, it's clear. These other gods in other cultures, they're wood, they're stone. You want to follow them, fine, but they can't talk like I can. And this is God speaking. They can't create like I can. And this is a really, in Isaiah 41, we call it a trial speech, where God puts the other gods of other cultures on trial.
Right.
They can't do what I said. He puts them on trial and he says, that's it.
Well, and
Well, and these are humans writing this story,
Yeah.
so they're.
well, it's another thing I've been praying about a little bit more is like in the Hindu culture, like there's a lot of gods, and like they're all
Yeah.
kind of comfortable with the idea that all these gods exist, but in the Western culture, Christianity,
Right.
it is really like, well, no, we're right, you're
Right.
wrong. Whereas in other cultures, it's like we can all be a little right, like it's not as black and white as we like to see it over here.
So is our God a myth? Is that our myth?
Well,
Is
I-
our God a myth? Is that what you said?
What was that?
Did you say, is our God a myth?
Under the academic
To some people, it probably is.
Under the academic
definition.
definition of cultural explanation of origins, all religion would be mythology.
Just don't like to think of it. that
Wait,
way.
because the word mythology has changed its cultural setting and the baggage goes along with the idea of falsehood.
right.
By definition, it is a myth, but this is the myth we believe.
It's our myth.
It's
It's our
our
mythology. It's our explanation.
Culturally, we believe it.
Yes,
it is-
It's not a myth.
No,
And remember, it's ancient Israel, and if we're claiming this religion, which we
Yeah,
are,
right.
it's our prehistory. And so remember that the whole thing of mythology, help me out if I'm wrong here, Joe, this whole thing of mythology, it's without a time frame. So it's just there. And then, once we start talking about Genesis 12 onward, then you have God as our God, and then these sons of God come in occasionally, or the angels come in occasionally, but God, from once you get into Israel's history, God is their God. And not to say that they aren't influenced. You gotta remember, ancient Israel is in the ancient Near East, and they're the new kid on the block. One of the new kids on the block. A lot of these other ancient cultures have been around for a while, so the writers have been influenced by these mythological cultures. And they kind of take a little bit from here, a little bit from there. The flood story that we have here, and some of you already pointed out, is because of the wickedness, when we looked at the title. Well, in one of the Mesopotamian flood stories, the reason they had the flood is because the people, number one, were getting too numerous, so the gods were concerned about that. And maybe they'll get too much in number and they'll take over the gods. And the other reason is that they were too noisy. The chief god couldn't go to sleep. But for the flood story in Genesis, the flood came because they were wicked, not because they were too numerous. So that was borrowed and then, ancient Israel put their spin or whatever you want to call it, their cultural say into it.
So would it be safe to make this statement? Genesis 1 through 11. Is, and I have to be careful in how I word it, but is the mythology of the story of how it came to be according to ancient Israel. But ancient Israel begins in Genesis 12.
Some would, yeah, and some would even go further and say, and I don't want to say this could take us off, but there are some biblical scholars who don't even ascribe the history to Abraham. They think it came much later, maybe later pre-exilic period or the exilic. But that'll kind of get us off track. But someone like John Bright, who was a solid church or biblical historian. Are you familiar with John Bright?
I am not.
His history of ancient Israel started with Abraham.
So if we take Abraham as being a literal person, the story he was telling his kids is Genesis 1 to 11.
Yeah. That's a good, simple way of trying to bring this together. We're probably out of time, yes.
This has been very interesting. Thank you, Joe.
So, are you guys okay with this? I mean, we're gonna be here for a while now.
Talk about those Nephilim.
Yeah, no, we're talking about the Nephilim, we'll talk about the Hebrews, which are the Gibberim.
Attractive
And
women.
then we'll talk about, at the end of verse 4, it says men of renown, and that's the name. The name.
The name.
Hebrew is the name, and it means name in Hebrew can mean name is Jake or Dave, but it can also mean reputation. One's name is one's reputation, and that's how we get. So this is why the Hebrew is important, but in certain aspects. So there's a lot here in these 4 verses. But what my goal is to get some of these things out of the way, so then we can start seeing that this perhaps is an etaology as to why certain people roam the earth.
Why certain people did what?
Roam the earth.
The descendants
You
of
never
these
used the word
heroes.
spies. I kept thinking, are they spying for God? No,
Well, it could be, but yeah.
because they keep going back with stories about what's happening.
Yeah. Well, okay, this is where we're headed for the next, who knows how many weeks.
Thank you.
Let's keep going. You're welcome.